Rome wasn't built in a day, but when it was, it took a lot of manpower to keep the city clean and safe. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we are exploring some of the jobs that needed to be done in ancient Rome that were so disgusting they paid really well. The Roman Empire is often thought of as this great empire that just lasted forever. In reality, the Roman Empire only lasted for 500 years. That's about the same amount of time as between the American Revolution and today. And during that time, the Roman Empire spanned 3 continents and spoke many languages. It was one of the most diverse empires in all of history. And at its peak, it had over 1 million people living in the city of Rome alone. So what kind of jobs did these people do to make the greatest city in the world run smoothly? Let's find out. One of the worst jobs in ancient Rome, yet one of the most important, was being an undertaker. This job came with the highest pay, mainly because of how dangerous the job was. Undertakers would have to go into the catacombs and dig up bodies from their tombs. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, the thing was, these bodies weren't always fully decomposed. The job of an undertaker wasn't like the job of a mortician. When someone died, they would be put into a tomb with the expectation that they would be entombed forever. Sometimes, however, families would come back and exhume their loved ones so that they could be put into a better tomb, or so that they could be moved closer to family members who had passed away. These catacombs could be pretty dangerous though. If an undertaker dug up the wrong tomb, they could end up angering the wrong family. Not to mention, if they dug up a body that wasn't completely decomposed, it could end up getting them covered in feces and other bodily fluids. There were also plenty of stories about bodies moving in their tombs, and many undertakers went insane after hearing the moans and screams of the dead in the night. But despite the danger and the gross-out factor, undertakers were paid very well and were usually given other jobs, such as running taverns or brothels. Rome was known for its amazing plumbing and aqueducts, but those things aren't going to fill themselves. Enter the aqueduct workers. Aqueducts brought fresh water into the city of Rome from miles away, and without them, the over 1 million people in Rome would have no access to fresh drinking water, and you can probably guess where that would lead. No water also means no sanitation, which also leads to even more problems. Now, the construction of the aqueducts required some very brave individuals. Building something that large and complex required skilled engineers and architects to design it, and then thousands of laborers to actually get the project completed. Once the aqueducts were up and running, there still had to be maintenance performed on them, and that meant that sometimes workers would have to climb into the aqueducts and clean them by hand. Just imagine how unsanitary that would be. Also, think about all the animals that would live inside a giant pipe filled with fresh water. You would need to clean out the aqueducts regularly to prevent disease from spreading through the water. So while the aqueducts were a monumental achievement for the Romans, they were also responsible for some of the dirtiest jobs in the city. Ancient Rome was very much an equal opportunity employer. While most slaves were forced to work in fields or as domestic servants, some were given the opportunity to work in the Roman military. But don't get too excited. Being a slave in the military didn't mean that you were treated better. It just meant that your master was putting you to use in a different way. A big part of any military is their supply chain, and someone has to haul all of the necessary supplies to the front lines. Slaves would be forced to carry heavy loads across long distances, and the sad reality was that most of them wouldn't survive the journey. Oftentimes, slaves would be put to work hauling supplies to the front lines and then forced to fight alongside their masters as soon as they arrived. It was a great way to use up your assets, especially since Roman law said that any property acquired through war was considered legitimate. To make matters worse, there wasn't really such a thing as a veteran in ancient Rome either. As soon as you were able to fight, you were expected to fight, and you were only given a noble burial when you died in battle. So while the Roman army had many famous generals and legendary soldiers, there were also plenty of nameless faces that hauled supplies and got very little recognition for their efforts. Many of the jobs in ancient Rome were reserved for slaves, but some of them were reserved for prisoners of war. Prisoners of war in ancient Rome weren't typically given a choice about what their sentence would be. They were sentenced to hard labor, usually building roads or aqueducts, and even if they weren't killed in the process, they were lucky. Most prisoners of war in ancient Rome were condemned to death, usually by crucifixion. While working on these projects may not have been fun, it was definitely better than the alternative. Unfortunately for these unlucky prisoners, most of the projects they were forced to work on were outside of the city walls, so they never got to see the fruits of their labor. Even though prisoners of war were expected to do menial labor, sometimes they were used for much more sinister reasons. Whenever Rome hosted games in the Colosseum, they liked to put on a good show, and nothing gets crowds going wild like watching men fight to the death. Prisoners of war were often pitted against each other, or against wild animals to entertain the crowds, and chances were that neither prisoner would leave the arena alive. Other times, prisoners of war were forced to be gladiators. This wasn't necessarily a death sentence, but it was a tough gig. Not only were they forced to fight other prisoners, but they were also forced to perform for the amusement of others. And in the end, they would often meet their demise in the arena. Now let's stay in the arena and talk about another scary job, animal trainer. Not only were prisoners forced to be gladiators, but but gladiators were also forced to fight against wild animals. Then someone had to train these animals to be fierce enough to take on the mightiest warriors in the empire. Training these animals probably wasn't the most difficult task, but it was definitely the most dangerous. Getting mauled by a lion or torn apart by a pack of wolves is never a good time. To make matters worse, animal trainers rarely achieved fame or glory. They were pretty much invisible unless something went horribly wrong, like say a lion escaped its cage and started attacking spectators. Then the trainer would become famous for all the wrong reasons. Still, someone had to train these beasts, and it was a high-paying job, so maybe it was worth the risk. There's no job more important than keeping the public safe, and that's why firefighters were in charge of protecting the citizens of ancient Rome. Yes, you heard that right. Firefighters in ancient Rome were slaves. While Rome was known for its impressive aqueducts and public works, it was also known for its frequent fires. Rome was densely populated, and most buildings were made of wood, so fires could spread quickly. Plus, most homes had oil lamps and fireplaces, which could easily cause a fire if left unattended. Since there was no such thing as an insurance policy, homeowners relied on the goodwill of firefighters to save their property, and that wasn't always easy. Oftentimes, firefighters wouldn't respond to a fire unless they were paid up front. This was probably a smart move on their part, as there were almost no regulations on the job. One minute you could be a respected member of society, and the next you could be getting attacked for trying to extinguish someone's burning house. But while firefighters might have saved a lot of lives and property, they didn't exactly have the best reputation. This was mostly because firefighting was seen as a job for the lowest class of Roman society. So if you were assigned to be a firefighter, you were pretty much destined to be a low man on the totem pole for the rest of your life. These jobs might not have paid very well, but they also didn't come with much risk. What jobs in ancient Rome paid really well and were pretty safe? You'd be surprised at how many options there were. The Roman Empire was massive, and they needed people to help govern it. And you don't need to be in charge to get paid well. Ancient Rome had everything from postmen to judges and lawyers. Sure, the pay might not have been great for lower-level positions, but if you were talented enough, you could advance and rake in the cash. After all, the Roman Empire did have a sort of civil service exam, and if you scored high enough, you could be on your way to a comfortable life in Rome. So if you were a teacher, doctor, or anything in between, you had a chance at making good money in ancient Rome. Just don't expect to get rich being a firefighter. Thanks for watching. How would you feel about doing some of these jobs? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.